It's March, 1943. You're standing in a hardware store holding a seed packet that cost you 5 cents. Somewhere behind you, a poster is telling you this is your patriotic duty. But you're not really thinking about patriotism. You're thinking about the math. Ration books are thin this month. The grocer's shelves have gaps in them that weren't there 2 years ago. And that 5-cent packet in your hand is being sold to you as the fix. Plant it. And by the end of the season, you'll have quietly saved your household $312. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $5,500. From 5 cents a patch of dirt and some string. Here's the part that actually earns 20 minutes of your time. The same government pushing that number is, in the very same year, telling millions of other Americans, in writing, not to bother planting a garden at all. Weak soil, bad light, a waste of tools the country needs elsewhere. If you live in a city, the official position is closer to don't than do. A system that guarantees savings with one hand and discourages the exact behavior that produces those savings with the other isn't confused. It's engineered. Somebody decided who was allowed to win. And the lone backyard hobbyist wasn't the intended winner. By the end of this video, you'll see the victory garden for what it actually was. Not a hobby, but a 5-goal federal system running on a currency nobody called a currency. You'll see why the least glamorous gardener in the country mattered more than the showcase suburban plot. And you'll watch that exact same system get rebuilt without irony behind barbed wire. One caveat first, because I'd rather lose you here than lie to you later. The $312 figure doesn't trace to a verified primary source. It lives in retellings, not in the original USDA paperwork. Hold it loosely. It's the hook. Everything after it I can back up. Most videos on this topic start from one sentence. Victory gardens existed to grow food for the war. That sentence is wrong, or at least incomplete enough to be misleading, because it's not what the government's own 1942 guide actually says. The charter had 5 separate goals: increase fresh produce supply, promote preservation, save families money, provide gardening access for urban dwellers specifically, boost morale. Read that list again. Grow vegetables isn't goal 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the way you'd assume. It's the delivery mechanism for 5 different policy outcomes running at once: nutritional, economic, logistical, psychological. That's the first clue that this program wasn't agriculture, with a slogan stapled to it. It was policy wearing overalls. Every rule that follows in this video, where gardens were allowed, who got trained, what got tracked, traces back to one of those 5 lines. Keep them in your head. They're the skeleton. Not every victory garden was the same bet, and the government didn't treat them the same way. Tier 1, the backyard plot, cheap, small, and, according to the National Park Service, actively discouraged in dense cities. Weak soil, poor light, and worse, it burned through fertilizer, pesticide, and tools the war effort needed somewhere else. The government said this plainly in official guidance. Your yard was a bad return on scarce inputs. Tier 2, the community garden, schoolyards, parks, vacant lots, company-owned land. This is where the institutional weight actually went, because a community plot satisfies Goal 4, urban access, without wasting a single unit of Goal 3's ledger. 2 objectives, 1 shovel. Tier 3, the institutional garden. Nobody puts this tier in the cheerful version. Victory gardens were planted at Oak Ridge, a Manhattan project site, and at the National Institutes of Health, where facility managers handed employees land to grow food on. Once a hobby shows up inside a nuclear weapons facility, the word hobby stops applying. That's infrastructure with a trowel. And the real barrier to entry wasn't money, it was competence. The USDA expected roughly 18 million families to garden, and most of them had never grown so much as a windowsill herb. So the campaign didn't sell inspiration. It sold handbooks, standardized plans and classes, onboarding at the scale of a civilian workforce. Here's the mechanism underneath everything else in this video. And it isn't gardening. It's accounting. Rationing in 1943 ran on a point system, a currency that existed alongside the dollar, printed in coupon books instead of bills. Every can of tomatoes you didn't need to buy was a point you didn't need to spend. Every point you didn't spend was a transport slot freed up, a factory labor hour redirected, a rail car that could carry something the military actually needed instead of civilian produce. One tomato plant does nothing to that system. Nothing. It's a rounding error next to a war economy moving millions of tons of material a year. But 18 million households, each quietly shaving a few dollars and a few ration points off their monthly draw. That's not a rounding error anymore. That's a second, informal currency, denominated in vegetables, circulating underneath the official one. And this is the actual delta most coverage of this topic misses. The government didn't want your tomatoes. It wanted your labor. Growing, weeding, canning, storing. Every hour you spent doing that was an hour of supply chain work the state didn't have to pay a trucker, a warehouse, or a cannery employee to do instead. The victory in Victory Garden wasn't nutritional. It was logistical. You weren't a hobbyist being encouraged. You were unpaid infrastructure being recruited, one seed packet at a time. And the USDA understood this well enough to build the program around timing, not just volume. A 1943 guide didn't market the tomato as a summer treat. It marketed it as shelf-stable nutrition for winter. The entire point was banking the surplus for January, when ration books were thinnest and transport was tightest. A tomato in July is a snack. A tomato in a glass jar in January is a strategic asset. That's not a garden. That's a household treasury, hedging against a currency it knew would lose value later in the year. The surplus didn't even stay inside individual households. The original 1942 guide directed extra produce toward storage for school lunches, welfare agencies, and local emergency food needs. Your extra tomatoes weren't just your family's insurance policy. On paper, they were rootable. A household surplus that could, in theory, land on a plate 3 neighborhoods away, inside a public system that never called itself a public system. If hidden economies like this one are your kind of rabbit hole, the math running underneath something that looks simple on the surface, subscribe. That's the entire premise of this channel. Let's keep pulling the thread. Here's the part that inverts everything you'd assume about which garden mattered most. The showcase plots, Oak Ridge, the big suburban yard with a fence and a hand pump make for a good newsreel frame. They were not the engine. The engine was the cheap, invisible plot. A widow's windowsill box, a kid's schoolyard bed, 3 tomato plants, and a coffee can on a fire escape. Think of it the way an insurance company thinks about its policyholders. One enormous policy on one enormous asset is exciting to underwrite, but it's fragile. A single bad year wipes out the whole position. A million small policies, each contributing a tiny premium, is boring and nearly indestructible, because no single failure can take the pool down. Victory Garden economics worked the same way. 18 million small, first-time under-resourced gardens is a functioning national food buffer. One perfect institutional garden is a photograph. This is also where Goal 5, morale, stops being decoration and starts doing measurable work. A woman with 1 tomato plant on a fire escape wasn't moving meaningful tonnage, but she was one more household that felt like a stakeholder instead of a bystander. And that feeling is what kept 18 million people paying into the pool long after the novelty wore off. To keep that pool full, the government had to do more than print pamphlets. It had to build an environment where opting out felt like the strange choice, not the normal one. Posters on every wall that had space for one. Radio spots, school lessons built around the garden bed. Newsreels showing ordinary kitchens mid-canning. None of it sold vegetables. All of it sold identity, and identity spreads faster than nutrition advice ever could. For anyone who genuinely couldn't garden, no land, no health, no time, the program still assigned a role. Preserve food on someone else's behalf. Deliver flowers to hospitals and to people who couldn't leave their homes. On paper, generous and optional. In practice, it closes the last exit. There was no version of this system where you got to stand fully outside it. The program even reshaped what people ate without them noticing it happening. The National Park Service notes that Victory Gardens introduced ordinary households to crops like Swiss chard and kohlrabi, vegetables most families had never grown or eaten before. A population trained to eat a wider range of crops is a population less dependent on any single supply chain, which loops straight back to Goal 1 and Goal 3 at once. The unfamiliar vegetable wasn't a side effect, it was the point. Here's where the democracy framing collapses completely. The Victory Garden slogan didn't stop at the edge of free society. The National Park Service documents gardens at Manzanar, Amache, Poston, and Tooele Lake, along with other war relocation centers, assembly centers, and Department of Justice camps. People who had lost their homes, their businesses, and their freedom were still growing gardens under the exact same banner the government used to sell the program to everyone else. Sit with that. The same 5-goal charter: produce, preservation, savings, urban access, morale, kept operating inside a fence perimeter with guard towers. Morale, of all things, doesn't survive that translation cleanly. And yet, the gardens kept going. The archaeology is the part that actually stops you. At Amash, researchers pulled homemade wheelbarrow parts out of the ground. Planter pots built from repurposed tin cans. Watering tools made from perforated cans, engineered by people with almost nothing to engineer with. To fight alkaline desert soil that wasn't built to hold anything, gardeners mixed in crushed abalone shell, crumbled eggshell, ammonium nitrate, phosphorus, potassium, forcing fertility out of ground that had none to spare. They grew traditional vegetables like kohlrabi and Swiss chard, and at some sites applied shake, a Japanese landscaping technique that borrows distant scenery into a garden's design inside a prison camp, using a horizon that was the one thing nobody could fence off. Some of them planted rows knowing they might be transferred to another camp before the harvest ever came in. That's not patriotism. That's cultural survival, wearing the same language the government used everywhere else to sell savings bonds. And it's the sharpest possible proof of this video's actual thesis. The Victory Garden was never mainly about abundance. It was about managing scarcity efficiently, and that logic ran just as coldly inside the camps as it did in a suburban backyard, with even less room for error. Here's the unglamorous bottom line the montage never shows you. The clean number is $312 saved per plant. The real number sits underneath a pile of costs that story leaves out entirely. The labor of digging and weeding and canning, the household cost of jars, lids, and, increasingly, pressure cookers. In 1942, Americans bought roughly 66,000 pressure cookers. By 1943, that number hit 315,000. Nearly a 5-fold jump in a single year. Driven by families racing to preserve a surplus, the government had spent a year convincing them to grow in the first place. That statistic is the real cost center of this entire story, and it's the one number the feel-good version leaves out. A pressure cooker in 1943 wasn't cheap, and it wasn't always in stock. Wartime metal shortages hit exactly the kind of manufacturing that makes pressure cookers. So the program that told you to grow more than you needed also, indirectly, triggered a consumer scramble for the one appliance required to keep any of it from spoiling. The savings were real. They weren't free. They were financed with equipment shortages, hours of unpaid domestic labor that fell almost entirely on women, and a household economy quietly reorganized around a war most of these families experienced only through a ration book and a poster. The garden didn't just grow food, it spun up a second informal economy of jars, gaskets, and canning classes, running in the background of a war most streets never saw directly. Every engineered system has a failure mode. This one had two, and they're both instructive. Failure 1, treating the backyard as the whole strategy. Households that ran their private plot in isolation, instead of feeding into the community in institutional tiers, got exactly the outcome the National Park Service warned about. Wasted fertilizer, wasted tools, a garden that consumed scarce inputs without a return that justified the draw. The system worked at community and institutional scale. It underperformed badly the moment someone tried to run it purely as a private project, disconnected from the pool. Failure 2. Treating morale as a free add-on. It's tempting to read the whole campaign as propaganda with no real economics behind it. Posters and nothing underneath. That reading misses the mechanism. Morale wasn't the payoff. It was the retention system that kept 18 million households paying into the pool long enough for the other 4 goals to compound. Pull the morale messaging out, and participation collapses, and without participation at scale, none of the ration point currency, none of the preservation math, none of the school lunch surplus routing works at all. The camps proved this in the most unsettling way possible. Even where the state had already broken the democracy promise entirely, the underlying scarcity logic kept running, because scarcity doesn't check whether the system around it is just. So, did one tomato plant really save $312? Maybe. In the right household, in the right year, under conditions nobody fully wrote down. But fixating on that single number is like reading one line of a household budget and thinking you understand the whole family's finances. Pull back, and the victory garden stops looking like a wholesome hobby and starts looking like a 5-goal, 3-tier federal system running on a shadow currency, insured by 18 million small policyholders instead of a few large ones. A system that ran on identical math, whether you were a suburban family with a nice fence or a family incarcerated behind one. We traded all of that for the convenience of the modern grocery aisle. We lost the preservation economy of jars and pressure cookers. We lost the community scale coordination of the schoolyard plot. And we lost the uncomfortable honesty of a government willing to tell people in plain language exactly which of their choices were a good use of scarce resources and which weren't. Today, as our own supply chains show their own cracks, that 1943 tomato plant looks less like nostalgia and more like a blueprint, for better and for worse. Strip away the posters and the patriotism, and the whole system reduces to one sentence. The house only wins when the citizens become the infrastructure. Is modern food security too centralized? Should more of it live at the household and community level, the way it did in 1943? Or did that system only work because a government was willing to be that blunt about scarcity? Tell me in the comments, and if hidden economics like this one are your thing, the stuff that never makes it into the headline number, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this underneath the surface.